It began not with the sound of battle, but with the faint hum of a machine. A single operator sat in a narrow radio room somewhere on the outskirts of Tokyo, his uniform pressed, his face expressionless, his hand moving carefully across a page of coded text. Outside the night was still. Inside the air was thick with the weight of silence. He adjusted the dial, listening to a whisper that came from across the Pacific, a transmission so weak it could have been mistaken for static. But to him, it was the heartbeat of the enemy. The message was short, precise, and seemingly routine. It spoke of American fleet movements near the Central Pacific, positions, fuel reports, and a subtle suggestion that a large-scale operation was being prepared. The operator copied it down without question, unaware that what he was hearing had been designed for him to hear. The Americans had sent it not to each other but to him, and to everyone like him. That was how it began, the quiet war beneath the noise, where the greatest victories were won not through strength, but through belief. By the early months of 1942, Japan's empire stood at its height. In less than a year, its armies had conquered territories that stretched from the mountains of Burma to the islands of the South Pacific. Singapore had fallen. The Philippines were on the brink. The rising sun flew over lands that had never before known its light. To the world, Japan seemed unstoppable, its soldiers fearless, its navy unmatched, its intelligence precise. At the heart of this machine was an unshakable confidence in information. Tokyo's intelligence officers believed they understood the United States, its industry, its military, even its psychology. They saw America as unprepared, divided, still clinging to an old world that Japan had already outgrown. In the corridors of the Imperial Navy General Staff, maps lined the walls, dotted with red pins that marked the slow suffocation of American power. The generals studied them with pride. Each new conquest confirmed what they already believed, that they were destined to dominate the Pacific, guided by divine will and flawless intelligence. But confidence is the first disguise of blindness. While Japan's spies sent reports from Honolulu, Manila, and San Francisco, American counterintelligence was quietly dismantling their networks. Some agents were captured, others turned, a few disappeared entirely. And yet, the reports kept flowing back to Tokyo, uninterrupted, perfectly written, perfectly timed. No one questioned how. In Washington, a handful of men understood what was happening. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been wound so deep that it rewrote the way America thought about war. In the months that followed, the United States did not simply rebuild its fleets, it rebuilt its mind. The Navy created divisions dedicated not just to gathering intelligence but to crafting it. Their purpose was to feed the enemy exactly what it wanted to believe. Every wire, every code, every whisper that left an American transmitter was a potential weapon. It was in these shadowed offices that the art of counterintelligence took shape. The architects were not soldiers but thinkers, mathematicians, linguists, cryptographers, and psychologists. They understood that truth could be forged just as easily as steel. Among them was Commander Joseph Rockefort, a quiet genius stationed in Pearl Harbor, whose eccentric brilliance would alter the course of the Pacific War. Rockefort worked in a converted basement filled with typewriters, teletype machines, and maps layered with colored pins. His team called it Station HYPO. Day and night, they listened to the enemy's voice, thousands of Japanese transmissions intercepted and decoded, line by line, pattern by pattern. To others it looked like chaos. To Rockefort, it was a symphony waiting to be understood. He could sense meaning in repetition, rhythm and static. From fragments of intercepted traffic, he reconstructed entire movements of fleets, the timing of operations, even the intentions of admirals he would never meet. Yet as his understanding deepened, so did his ambition. Reading the enemy was not enough. If America was to win, it had to learn how to speak back, in the enemy's own language, in the patterns they trusted most. That was the birth of the Great Deception. The Japanese had no reason to suspect anything. Their code systems, Jan 25, the backbone of Imperial Navy communications, had been updated regularly, and their analysts believed them unbreakable. The Americans knew better. Piece by piece, they had cracked its layers, finding meaning in its numbers and context in its noise. But they didn't announce this breakthrough. They hid it. The greatest advantage of knowledge is not to reveal it, but to use it in silence. So began a campaign of invisible warfare. False coordinates, fake fleet orders, and invented reconnaissance reports were carefully crafted and transmitted across channels known to be monitored by Japan. Some were sent through compromised agents, others through open diplomatic cables that Tokyo would intercept. Each lie was wrapped in a fragment of truth, giving it just enough weight to survive scrutiny. The goal was not to fool them once, it was to make deception part of their reality. Tokyo's intelligence network swallowed the bait whole. In their daily summaries to the High Command, they reported confirmed American weaknesses, shortages of aircraft carriers, delays in production, disorganization in Pacific Command structures. These reports traveled upward through ranks of confident officers, all the way to the Emperor's War Council. Each new deception reinforced the next. By the summer of 1943, Japan's entire strategic view of the Pacific was being shaped by American counterintelligence. The empire was fighting ghosts, fleets that did not exist, battalions that had never been deployed, convoys that were nothing more than words on paper. And every time Japanese commanders reacted, they revealed more about their real capabilities, their priorities, their fears. The brilliance of the American system was its restraint. They never tried to overwhelm the enemy with lies. They simply guided what the enemy already believed. It was manipulation through suggestion, the psychological precision of a chess master who wins by letting the opponent move first. Each time Tokyo made a decision based on false intelligence, it only confirmed their confidence in their own system. Doubt never entered the room. Back in Pearl Harbor, Rockefeller's men tracked these decisions with quiet satisfaction. Every Japanese transmission they intercepted after a deception proved that the game was working. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they fell silent, realizing how far their words had traveled, how many lives would now move according to a plan that existed only in their imagination. For a few of them it was exhilarating. For others it was haunting. But in Tokyo there was no laughter, only calculation. The Imperial Navy's intelligence section, led by officers loyal to the Emperor, prided itself on its efficiency. They gathered information obsessively, cross-referencing, reanalyzing, convinced that numbers could never lie. They believed their adversaries were too emotional, too chaotic, too slow to understand the precision of Japanese thought. That conviction was the key the Americans used to open their minds. And yet, within this quiet war of signals, there were moments of doubt. A few Japanese officers noticed the inconsistencies, reports that contradicted one another, data that didn't align with battlefield outcomes. But the war culture of the time did not permit questioning superiors. Doubt was weakness. Silence was discipline. And so, those who suspected the truth buried it beneath loyalty. The deception continued. From Washington to Pearl Harbor to the smallest intelligence outpost on a Pacific island, America maintained a single rhythm, a pulse of crafted illusion that guided the empire toward its own destruction. It was the perfect trap, not because it was hidden, but because it looked exactly like what the enemy wanted to see. By late 1943, the stage was set for the next act of this unseen war, a deception so vast it would shape the outcome of the entire Pacific campaign. The Americans were ready to turn information into a battlefield of its own. The Japanese, blind to the possibility, prepared for what they thought was victory. They were about to discover that the truth they trusted most had been written for them, line by line, frequency by frequency, by the very enemy they sought to defeat. In the winter of 1943, the Pacific was both vast and shrinking. The ocean still stretched unbroken from California to the shores of Asia, but for the men who fought to control it, the world had narrowed to a series of coded messages. Every move, every supply line, every heartbeat of strategy pulsed through invisible channels of information. Whoever mastered those signals would master the war. In Tokyo, within the stone walls of the Imperial Navy General Staff, the confidence was absolute. The war had reached a stalemate, but the officers believed they understood why. To them, the American response was slow, clumsy, reactive. Their intelligence officers brought them detailed reports from across the Pacific. Fleet strengths, shipyard capacities, even whispers about American morale. Each figure was studied, debated, approved, and passed upward. Yet each number was a lie. The Americans had begun to turn intelligence itself into a weapon. Through networks of double agents, they fed the Japanese information crafted with surgical precision. Every false report was designed to confirm Tokyo's assumptions, never to contradict them. The deception wasn't random, it was engineered to feel authentic. It reinforced the worldview the Japanese High Command already believed in, that America was stretched thin, that its navy was vulnerable, and that Japan still had time to strike a decisive blow. At Pearl Harbor, Joseph Rockefeller watched the results unfold in real time. His codebreakers intercepted Japanese transmissions that referenced American fleet movements he knew didn't exist. When a false operation was reported from a captured agent in the Philippines, Tokyo responded exactly as intended. They shifted resources, redirected patrols, and adjusted their strategy, playing a game whose rules they didn't know had already been rewritten. Rockefeller didn't celebrate. He simply noted it in silence, another quiet victory in a war fought without front lines. But deception is never perfect. It requires constant maintenance, constant precision. A single careless move can reveal the illusion. The Americans learned that lesson the hard way early in 1943, when one false report contradicted a genuine naval movement. For days, analysts on both sides tried to reconcile the inconsistency. The Japanese nearly realized they were being fed information. But just as quickly they dismissed the idea. Their trust in their codes was unshakable. They assumed the mistake was human, an error in transmission, a delay in communication. They corrected their data and continued to believe. Belief is the most dangerous weapon in war. Once it takes hold, it defends itself more fiercely than any army. By spring, the American deception had evolved into a system. They called it traffic shaping, the deliberate creation of radio transmissions to mimic the flow of real operations. Entire phantom task forces were invented through the rhythm of radio chatter. Dozens of transmitters across the Pacific sent routine, meaningless signals, ship reports, weather logs, supply requests, all in perfect synchronization. To Japanese analysts listening on the other side, these patterns looked indistinguishable from real fleet activity. Charts filled with movement. Convoys seemed to appear and disappear across the ocean. In truth, the Americans were painting a picture of the Pacific that existed only in code. The genius of the operation lay not in what the Japanese heard, but in what they didn't. While Tokyo tracked phantom forces, the real American fleets moved silently through unmonitored channels. The deception created gaps in attention, blind spots in which real operations could unfold undetected. One officer later described it as hiding a whale in a school of fish. Inside Tokyo, the pressure to interpret these signals grew immense. The empire's survival depended on knowing where the next American strike would come. Every intercepted message was treated as a fragment of divine revelation. Analysts worked without sleep, their minds racing through endless grids of numbers. They didn't know that those numbers had been composed by men in Washington who understood their thinking better than they did themselves. As the war stretched into its third year, cracks began to show in Japan's intelligence network. Some field stations reported results that contradicted headquarters' assessments. A few agents complained that their transmissions went unanswered. Several vanished without explanation. But the structure of the system, the hierarchy of obedience, kept these concerns buried. The Japanese war machine could adapt to hunger, to exhaustion, to defeat. But it could not adapt to doubt. Meanwhile, in the United States, the scale of counterintelligence expanded far beyond the Navy. The newly coordinated Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, joined forces with naval cryptographers, Army intelligence, and the State Department. Together, they built an ecosystem of deception that reached from diplomatic cables to commercial shipping routes. Every channel the Japanese believed secure had been quietly infiltrated. Reports flowed into Tokyo describing American industrial shortages, fuel crises, and disorganized logistics. All were false. In reality, the United States was producing more war material than any nation in history. But on paper, on the documents the Japanese trusted, it appeared otherwise. They began to believe that America's massive output was an illusion of propaganda. They thought time was still on their side. That illusion shaped every major decision the empire made in 1943. Instead of retreating to defend their home islands, they planned new offensives in the South Pacific. Instead of conserving aircraft, they squandered them chasing phantom fleets. Each deception not only wasted Japan's resources, it distorted its sense of reality. In the spring of that year, a particularly intricate operation demonstrated just how far the Americans were willing to go. Through a network of double agents operating out of Mexico City, false intelligence reached Japanese naval attaches about a supposed buildup of American submarines near the Aleutian Islands. The information included serial numbers, commander names, and coded supply manifests, all fabricated. Within weeks, the Japanese diverted precious reconnaissance aircraft northward to investigate. They found nothing. When the operation was later analyzed in Washington, it was considered a masterpiece. But for the men behind it, there was no celebration, only the eerie satisfaction of power used invisibly. The deception had worked not because it was flawless, but because it was believable. That was the paradox of counterintelligence. The closer a lie came to truth, the harder it became to distinguish between the two. By late summer, the deception was no longer just a strategy, it had become a philosophy. The Americans had learned that knowledge itself could be weaponized. Every intercepted message, every captured agent, every rumor could be reshaped into a tool of control. The war had become a battle not of territory but of perception. Tokyo, still confident, continued to rely on its intelligence network as the foundation of its military planning. Each night, messages were compiled into thick reports for the Admiralty. Charts displayed the supposed positions of American carrier groups. Commanders pored over them, believing they saw the future. They didn't realize they were reading a map drawn by their enemies. And so the empire prepared its next move. In September 1943, Japanese strategists concluded that the Americans would attempt a massive counteroffensive in the Central Pacific. Their data seemed conclusive. Their sources were reliable. Their calculations were impeccable. Orders were issued, ships were repositioned, air squadrons redeployed. It was the perfect trap, except the trap was theirs, and they were walking directly into it. At Pearl Harbor, Rockefeller's analysts watched as intercepted Japanese communications confirmed the shift. They could almost feel the tension across the ocean, the weight of decisions being made on false foundations. For weeks, they remained silent, letting the deception mature. The truth would reveal itself not in words but in movement. By the time the Japanese realized what had happened, it would be too late. The Americans had not only hidden their intentions, they had rewritten the enemy's. The Pacific was now an ocean of ghosts. Phantom fleets sailed in invisible waters. Phantom reports filled real files. Phantom victories guided real men to their deaths. The line between truth and illusion had blurred completely. And in that blur, the outcome of the war began to take shape. It was no longer just about who could see more clearly. It was about who could make the other see what wasn't there. The Americans had turned perception into power. The Japanese, still blind in their brilliance, believed they had outsmarted their enemy. Neither side knew it yet, but the greatest battle of the war would not be fought with ships or bombs. It would be fought with information. By early 1944, the illusion had become a world of its own. The Americans had learned to weave truth and fiction into a seamless fabric, a pattern so convincing that even their own officers sometimes forgot where the line was drawn. Messages passed through channels layered with half-truths, code fragments, and misdirection. Every signal had a purpose. Every silence, a meaning. The Pacific theater had become an ocean not of geography, but of deception. In Tokyo, that deception began to shape the empire's entire vision of the war. The Imperial Navy believed it still commanded initiative. Reports from the Intelligence Bureau described American fleets scattered and overextended. The enemy cannot strike soon, the summaries declared. Their resources are strained, their shipyards overwhelmed. The words carried authority, printed on official paper and stamped with seals. No one questioned their origin. No one noticed that the information had originated from signals deliberately broadcast for them to find. The Americans called it Operation Venom. It wasn't a single operation but an evolving web of deceit, a continuous drip of controlled misinformation designed to feed Tokyo's arrogance. Under the direction of the Navy's Code Section and the newly integrated Office of Strategic Services, radio networks across the Pacific began transmitting leaked communications about non-existent naval movements. Some were supposedly from carrier groups preparing for assaults in the Marshall Islands. Others described phantom reinforcements heading toward the Aleutians or the South China Sea. The Japanese listening posts intercepted every signal. They decoded, cataloged, and analyzed them meticulously. The conclusion seemed undeniable. The United States was spread thin, defending too many fronts. That belief became doctrine. Strategic memos circulated through the Admiralty, confident in their analysis. The empire would strike before America could regroup. But the deception was deeper than signals alone. American intelligence had learned to exploit every human weakness within Japan's system. They understood how hierarchy suffocated skepticism. They knew that once a conclusion was approved by a superior, it became truth. And so they shaped their lies to flatter that system, to make every deception appear as a validation of previous assumptions. In February 1944, Tokyo ordered a major reallocation of forces toward what it believed was the next American target, the Marshall Islands. Ships and aircraft were diverted from the Marianas, the Philippines, and even the home islands to defend positions that no longer mattered. The Americans watched this unfold in real time through their own intercepts. The trap was working. When the actual assault began months later in the Marianas, Japan's defenses were scattered and confused. The empire had prepared for a battle that would never come, and ignored the one that did. The result was catastrophic. The Battle of the Philippine Sea became a slaughter. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft fell into the ocean, entire carrier groups destroyed in hours. The empire's air power was crippled, and with it, its last chance to turn the tide of the war. Yet in Tokyo, denial ran deeper than defeat. Reports filtered in describing the disaster, but the high command refused to believe its own eyes. They blamed weather, bad coordination, luck, anything but the possibility that their intelligence had been poisoned. In meetings, officers spoke of regrouping, of new offensives, still clinging to the same falsified data that had doomed them. The deception had become a belief system. Back in Washington, the architects of that belief watched the outcome with quiet unease. What had started as an act of strategy was now something darker. They had built a mirror for their enemy to look into, and the reflection had consumed him. Some among them wondered if there was a moral limit to deception, even in war. Others dismissed the thought. The only measure that mattered was victory. But not everyone could separate the two. In the basements of Pearl Harbor, where operators transmitted false messages daily, fatigue began to set in. Some questioned what they were doing, if manipulating entire nations through lies was any different from the destruction happening at sea. Their work was invisible, but its consequences were not. Every false message had a cost measured not in paper but in lives. Still, the deception continued. With the Marianas secured, American counterintelligence refined its methods further. They began experimenting with layered misinformation, using genuine operational leaks mixed with false details, so that no single message could be entirely dismissed or entirely trusted. The Japanese, desperate to make sense of the noise, dug deeper into their own assumptions, cross-checking illusions against illusions. The result was chaos disguised as order. The deeper tragedy was that Japan's intelligence system had once been formidable. Before the war, its officers had gathered information with remarkable skill, studying foreign fleets, mapping American supply lines, predicting strategic behavior. But war had changed the structure of power. What had begun as a disciplined network of analysts became a bureaucracy of obedience. Reports were written not to reflect truth, but to confirm expectations. The Americans exploited that perfectly. They understood something profound. Information alone does not create knowledge. It must be questioned, doubted, tested. The Japanese system had lost that ability. In their pursuit of certainty, they had killed curiosity. And that, more than any lie, sealed their fate. By late 1944, the psychological effects of the deception began to manifest. Within Japan's intelligence community, paranoia grew. Accusations of treachery spread quietly. Field agents were interrogated, some executed. Communications officers rotated constantly, afraid that any mistake might mark them as traitors. Yet the false information kept flowing, smooth and consistent. The Americans no longer had to push. The machine was now running on its own momentum. Inside the Imperial Palace, as Tokyo prepared for what it believed would be a last great battle to defend its empire, Emperor Hirohito's advisors presented him with intelligence summaries that were already outdated and wrong. They spoke of dwindling American strength, of hesitation in Washington, of divisions among Allied commanders. They were lies, but they were comforting ones. And comfort in war can be deadlier than any weapon. Across the Pacific, American commanders planned the next stage, the invasion of the Philippines. It was a massive undertaking requiring months of preparation and absolute secrecy. But secrecy was no longer just about silence, it was about noise. American counterintelligence began flooding the airwaves with new patterns of deception, suggesting multiple invasion points, contradictory timelines and phantom divisions. The Japanese attempted to decode it all, desperate to predict where the real attack would come. They saw everything. And in seeing everything they saw nothing. The invasion struck where they least expected. American forces landed, met fierce resistance, and pushed forward. Behind the battles, behind the headlines, the invisible war continued. Messages sent, intercepted, analyzed, believed. In Tokyo, the intelligence officers tried to piece together meaning from fragments. But by then there was nothing left to interpret. The system they had trusted to guide them had become a labyrinth without an exit. As winter approached, Japan's situation grew desperate. Cities burned, resources dwindled, yet the official intelligence summary still spoke of opportunities. Enemy morale is low, they wrote. Their losses are severe. These words were sent to the emperor himself, who read them in silence. Perhaps he wanted to believe them. Perhaps he knew they were lies. No one will ever know. For the Americans, victory seemed inevitable. But within the walls of their intelligence offices, a quieter realization took hold. They had not merely defeated an enemy, they had rewritten reality. The methods they had created, the systems of control and manipulation, would not end with this war. They had proven too effective, too seductive. Information had become a new form of power, one that could shape nations as surely as any bomb. And in that moment the future began. A future where wars would no longer be fought only with weapons, but with perception, where truth itself could be engineered, delivered, and believed. As the Pacific burned and the Empire of Japan began to crumble, no one on either side realized that the real battleground, the war of the mind, had only just begun. By the beginning of 1945, the war in the Pacific had shifted beyond redemption for Japan, but inside Tokyo, that truth was still unspoken. On the surface, the empire stood defiant. Soldiers still marched, factories still ran, and intelligence reports continued to assure the Admiralty that America's advance was faltering. Yet beneath the calm of paper and ceremony, there was a quiet unraveling. The first cracks appeared not in the battlefield but in the mind. Some intelligence officers began to notice that the numbers no longer made sense. Reports of American losses contradicted each other. Supply lines supposedly destroyed continued to function. And the enemy, who should have been exhausted, kept growing stronger. Still, no one dared to question the chain of command. It was easier to rewrite the data than to face the truth. In a windowless room of the Naval Intelligence Bureau, a mid-level officer named Lieutenant Commander Hideo Tanaka stared at his daily summary sheets. His superior had just ordered another revision: fewer American aircraft, more Japanese submarines. "The morale of our people depends on this," the man had said. Tanaka obeyed as always, but when the door closed, he whispered a quiet confession to the empty room: "None of this is real." He tore the corner of his paper and hid it in his pocket, as if to preserve one fragment of honesty from the wreckage of illusion. The Americans didn't know his name, but they were speaking directly to him. Every false message, every coded transmission, every phantom movement was designed for men like Tanaka, professionals bound by duty and faith, unable to see that the enemy had taken control of their thoughts. While Japan sank deeper into its self-created fog, the United States moved forward with precision. The codebreakers at Pearl Harbor continued their silent work, decoding Japanese transmissions that revealed the growing confusion inside Tokyo. Some messages contradicted earlier orders, others repeated the same directives word for word, as if no one dared to update them. Rockefeller's analysts watched the empire's intelligence collapse in slow motion. To them, it was proof that deception was working not just as a strategy, but as a contagion. In Washington, the victory of illusion had become both a triumph and a burden. The men of the Office of Naval Intelligence and the OSS knew they were shaping the final stage of the war, and that every decision they made inside their quiet offices would determine the lives of thousands across the Pacific. There were no uniforms here, no battle cries, only pens, teletypes, and minds sharpened to the edge of moral silence. The midpoint of the war's final act came in March 1945, when Tokyo intercepted a wave of messages suggesting that the United States intended to invade Formosa, now Taiwan, as its next major objective. The transmissions were detailed, listing fleet compositions, supply timetables, and command hierarchies. It was perfect intelligence. Too perfect. The Japanese High Command believed every word. They prepared defenses, shifted divisions, and waited for an attack that would never come. The real invasion struck the Philippines. When the first reports arrived of American landings far from where they were expected, the shock was immediate. For the first time, whispers began circulating in Tokyo's corridors that the empire had been deceived. Some blamed British trickery, Others accused traitors within their own ranks. A few dared to suggest that perhaps the Americans had broken their codes, an unthinkable heresy. Inside the Intelligence Bureau, paranoia turned inward. Secret investigations began. Rooms were searched, typewriters confiscated, officers questioned under suspicion of espionage. But the truth was simpler and more devastating. There had been no traitor. The enemy had never needed one. They had simply listened, and then spoken in the same voice. For a brief moment, the Americans paused to watch what they had created. The deception had achieved its ultimate form. Japan was now deceiving itself. Counterintelligence no longer required feeding false data. Tokyo's own analysts were generating illusions from the momentum of belief. It was the perfect mirror, self-sustaining, self-destructive. The midpoint of any story is a moment of realization, and here, in the quiet offices of both nations, realization came like an echo. The Americans understood that they had crossed into new territory, the weaponization of perception itself. The Japanese, though still blind to the full scale of their defeat, felt the first tremors of doubt. That doubt, once born, could never be silenced again. As spring turned to summer, the Empire's situation grew desperate. The Allies had taken the Marianas, and from newly captured airfields, waves of bombers began to strike the Japanese mainland. Cities burned nightly. The sky itself seemed to fall on fire. Yet even then, the official reports insisted that victory was possible, that America's will was breaking. The lies had grown too large to control. They were no longer tools but prisons. Inside Tokyo, officers walked through corridors filled with the smell of paper and smoke, pretending not to see the truth. When the Americans began firebombing Tokyo in March 1945, the devastation was beyond comprehension. Over 100,000 civilians were killed in a single night. Still, the intelligence summaries spoke of limited damage. It was not just denial, it was the institutionalization of deception. The Empire could no longer distinguish between reality and its reflection. In the basements of American intelligence, there was no celebration. The analysts read the intercepted Japanese cables, the empty reassurances, the hollow optimism, and felt an unfamiliar chill. It was one thing to deceive an enemy. It was another to watch that deception consume an entire nation. Some began to ask whether the line between strategy and cruelty had already been crossed. In June, as American submarines strangled Japan's supply lines, the counterintelligence operations turned to their final purpose: controlling the enemy's surrender. Through manipulated diplomatic channels, messages were allowed to reach Tokyo hinting that the Allies might accept negotiated peace if certain conditions were met. The intent was not mercy but confusion. The Americans wanted to fracture Japan's leadership, to divide the moderates from the hardliners, to make them question each other's motives. The Empire's final defense would not fall from bombs, but from distrust. The effect was immediate. Within Japan's War Council, arguments erupted. Some believed peace was possible, others saw such talk as treason. Every debate leaked into intelligence channels, then back again, distorted, amplified, and weaponized. American analysts read it all in real time, watching the Empire disintegrate from within. And yet, amidst the triumph of deception, a strange melancholy lingered. The men who had orchestrated this silent war began to wonder what would remain of truth once the war ended. They had proven that reality could be engineered, that nations could be guided by carefully shaped illusions. But what would happen when such power was no longer used against enemies, but against the world itself? For Japan, there was no such reflection. The collapse came too suddenly, too brutally. By the summer of 1945, the Empire's intelligence network was little more than fragments. Disconnected stations, dead frequencies, names written on lists of the missing. The voices that once reported confidently from across the Pacific had gone silent. And yet, Tokyo still listened, unwilling to believe the silence was real. The climax began not with surrender, but with the realization that surrender was inevitable. When the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, the Empire's illusions shattered in a single instant. No intelligence report could explain it. No code could decipher what had happened. The world had changed in a flash brighter than truth itself. The Americans intercepted the first panic transmissions from Japanese field stations. Confusion, disbelief, the desperate insistence that such destruction was impossible. A new weapon, one message read. A trick. Even in the face of annihilation, the reflex of denial persisted. the final echo of the War of Deception. Days later, Nagasaki burned. And then, at last, silence. In Washington, the men of counterintelligence received the news of Japan's surrender not with celebration, but with a kind of stunned quiet. The war they had fought, invisible, cerebral, relentless, was over. But as they looked at the world they had helped reshape, they could not escape a single haunting question. If truth could be controlled so completely, who would control it next? For the Japanese officers who survived, the realization came slowly. In interrogation rooms under the American occupation, they were shown documents, reports they themselves had written, laced with American invention. Many refused to believe them even as they read their own handwriting. Impossible, one said. Our intelligence was certain. The American interrogator closed the file and replied softly, "That was the problem." And with that, the war of illusions ended, not with victory or defeat but with revelation. When the silence finally came, it was unlike anything the world had heard before. The radio stopped. The coded chatter that had filled the air for 4 long years faded into nothing. Tokyo lay in ruins, a city of shadows and ash, and the empire that once dreamed of eternal victory had ceased to exist. But even in defeat, the ghosts of its illusions lingered. In the first days of occupation, American intelligence officers began the meticulous work of uncovering what remained of Japan's once formidable spy network. They walked through burned buildings where charred codebooks still lay on desks, through underground bunkers filled with half-melted typewriters and empty safes. What they found wasn't the machinery of espionage, but the evidence of self-deception. Most of Japan's secret files contained nothing of value: copies of falsified American orders, reports from double agents who had never existed, analyses of phantom fleets that had never sailed. For the Americans, it was proof of how completely the deception had worked. For the Japanese, it was a revelation that bordered on madness. Officers who had dedicated their lives to precision and loyalty found themselves staring at papers that mocked them. Some refused to believe it, insisting the documents were American fabrications. Others, in quiet despair, confessed that they had known, at least on some level, that the information had never felt right. But in a system built on obedience, doubt had been the one crime no one dared to commit. The interrogations began in the autumn of 1945. Inside a confiscated government building in Tokyo, teams of American officers questioned their former adversaries about methods, sources, and failures. Day after day, the same story emerged: misplaced trust, institutional pride, blind faith in the unbreakability of their codes. "We believed our system was perfect," one former naval analyst said. "We never considered that perfection could be the enemy." For the Americans listening, there was no satisfaction, only recognition. The war had ended, but the mirror it had created remained. They had proven that information could shape reality, that an empire could be defeated not by force, but by belief. And they understood, perhaps better than anyone, that such power could never truly be put away. In Washington, a new institution was taking shape, born from the lessons of the War of Deception. The Central Intelligence Agency, formed in 1947, inherited not only the methods of counterintelligence but its philosophy. Information was no longer a tool, it was a battlefield. The doctrines that had undone Japan now became the foundation of America's global strategy. The weapon that had destroyed an empire would now be turned toward the new enemy, the Soviet Union, and, in time, the entire world. But the victory of illusion carried a curse. Some of those who had built it began to feel the weight of what they had done. In private conversations, they admitted that the deception had changed them. They had spent too long in the shadows between truth and falsehood, too long learning to manipulate what others believed. "You start to forget what's real," one former OSS officer said years later. "You start to think the world is just another operation." The line between defense and delusion was gone. The weapon of information had no off switch. For Japan, the aftermath was quieter but no less profound. In the ruins of its intelligence service, a generation of scholars and officers gathered to understand how they had been deceived so completely. They studied the captured American documents, the intercepted transmissions, the double-agent networks. Over time, they began to call it the War of Mirrors. It was not just a failure of espionage, it was a collapse of philosophy. The empire had believed in its own reflection until the reflection consumed it. One Japanese historian, writing decades later, described it as a tragedy of logic. He argued that the empire's greatest flaw was not ignorance but certainty. "We did not lose because the Americans were more intelligent," he wrote. "We lost because we stopped asking questions." That observation would outlive the war itself. It became a quiet lesson in every modern conflict, that knowledge without doubt becomes blindness, and power without humility becomes ruin. The Americans, for all their success, could not escape the same truth. As the Cold War unfolded, the machinery of deception they had perfected turned inward. Propaganda, covert operations, psychological warfare, all drawn from the same principles that had once defeated Japan. The ghosts of 1943 still whispered through cables and offices, reminding those who listened that every illusion must eventually be believed by someone. Decades later, when classified files were finally opened to historians, the scale of the wartime deception astonished even those who had suspected it. It wasn't just the fake radio signals or the turned agents or the phantom fleets. It was the subtlety, the precision with which American intelligence had entered the Japanese mind and rearranged its logic from within. It was, as one analyst put it, a masterpiece of invisible war. But masterpieces always carry a shadow. The same techniques that won the war blurred the moral boundaries of peace. The victory had proven that the truth itself could be weaponized, that nations could be guided not by facts, but by perception. And once that realization took root, it could never be undone. For the Japanese officers who lived to see peace, memory was both burden and penance. Some joined the new intelligence agencies that emerged under American supervision, determined never to repeat the mistakes of their predecessors. Others withdrew from public life entirely, haunted by the knowledge that they had been instruments of their own defeat. A few took solace in writing, transforming their shame into philosophy. "The empire died," one of them wrote, "when it stopped believing in uncertainty." In a sense, both nations emerged from the war changed in the same way. The Americans had learned how to manipulate belief. The Japanese had learned how belief can destroy. Together, they had proven that the future would belong not to those who controlled territory, but to those who controlled perception. The world that followed, the world we live in now, was born from that revelation. Satellites replaced spies, computers replaced codebooks, but the essence remained. Information became the new geography and truth became negotiable. The war that began with a whisper across the Pacific never truly ended. It simply changed its language. Looking back, the story of Japan's intelligence failure reads almost like a parable. It tells us that arrogance blinds faster than ignorance, that loyalty without skepticism leads to ruin, and that in the age of information, deception can be as destructive as war itself. In one of the last debriefings before his retirement, a former American cryptographer was asked if he ever felt guilty for the lies he had helped create. He paused for a long time before answering. "Guilt," he said. "No. Maybe sadness. Because when you spend years writing fiction and calling it intelligence, you start to wonder whether you've changed the world, or just rewritten it. That question has no answer. It lingers like static on an empty frequency. In Tokyo today, the building that once housed the Naval Intelligence Bureau still stands. Its windows have been replaced, its rooms repurposed. Tourists pass it without notice. But those who know its history say that sometimes late at night, the wind through the hallways sounds like faint Morse code, the echo of messages sent into the void, still searching for someone to believe them. The war of deception ended on paper in 1945. But its reflection endures in every modern conflict, every political manipulation, every fabricated truth that moves nations. It reminds us that information is never pure. It is always filtered through desire, through fear, through belief. In the end, perhaps that is the real lesson of the Pacific War, that no matter how advanced our machines become, the most fragile code is still the human mind. The story began with a whisper across the sea, a signal faint enough to be mistaken for static. And it ends here, in silence, the silence that follows when the last illusion finally fades. Because in every war, long after the guns fall quiet, the echoes of deception remain. And they remind us that truth, once weaponized, never truly belongs to anyone again.